Recently, President Donald Trump announced his intention to use the American armed forces within American cities to control terrorist groups such as Antifa and other far-left movements, mainly due to the constant violence and terrorism carried out by these groups. However, this idea is controversial because on one hand, many people support it. After all, some people view the police forces with suspicion because they are subordinate to local political groups or because there are not enough of them to deal with these crises, while others condemn the act because it puts the government's social contract with the population at risk, as well as seeing this as a strategy by Trump to test the loyalty and willingness of the American military. In any case, this is not the first time this has happened in the United States, and in other countries, like Brazil for example, we often see the population wanting the armed forces to also join the fight against crime. After all, they're just there with nothing to do all day, just weeding and painting curbs. So, they should be useful in fighting crime since in theory they're better armed and better prepared. So, in today's video, let's see if it's a good idea to use the armed forces in public security. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know to help the Geopolitica Mundial channel keep growing. Your support may not stop, but it's very important and vital for the channel to keep existing. And also, follow us on Instagram and Telegram to stay updated on the channel's news and on geopolitics. The links are in the video description. I'm Adriano Peta, and this is the Geopolitica Mundial channel. Imagine a situation. Police officers are at the entrance of a favela in a big Brazilian city. They are equipped with pistols, maybe some submachine guns or shotguns, while they're being attacked by drug dealers who are better armed with rifles and other more aggressive weapons. Then some army armored vehicles arrive. Even some tanks are seen providing cover, with a few dozen soldiers wearing advanced protective gear, rifles, machine guns, and everything else you can imagine in a modern war, supporting the police officers. Just the weapons on the armored vehicles are enough to slice through the traffickers' defensive positions like butter. In addition, armed army helicopters are flying over the area to provide support. Some even have rockets installed. And when they see that scene, the criminals flee in panic, knowing they have no chance of victory. Imagining this scene excites the minds of children, teenagers, and especially mentally dysfunctional adults. Because that's not how life works. There are several reasons for this. The main one is that criminals are not intimidated by it. They're not afraid of all this military hardware. And the reason for this is that even if they saw the scene I mentioned, with armored vehicles capable of firing grenades, helicopters with rockets, artillery pieces, they know that none of that will be used. Let me be clear, it will never be used. The combat doctrine will never allow the use of this kind of weaponry in civilian territory, especially within our own country to fight a criminal faction, and they know that. These powerful armored vehicles will serve more as protection so the soldiers don't come under fire, rather than necessarily as an attack tool, and the helicopters will at most be used for observation. By the way, these soldiers, even though they are well equipped and armed, for the most part don't know the geography of that area. They don't know where anything is and have probably never been in combat, unlike the police officers who know the region like the back of their hand. And that intense shootout is nothing more than just another Thursday or Tuesday for them. And another thing that needs to be very clear is that the role of the military, of the armed forces, is the complete neutralization of the enemy by any means necessary. Whereas the role of the police officer is to restore law and order and preferably to capture criminals alive if possible. One is trained to do everything. The other is trained to deal with limitations. And if you put the one who was trained to do everything in a scenario where he can't do everything, the only possible outcome is failure. In 1992, the city of Los Angeles was in the middle of a huge popular uprising, after a trial acquitted police officers of assaulting a fugitive. Part of the population was looting businesses in the city, while gangs of criminals took advantage to attack rivals and rob banks, jewelry stores, and markets. It was complete chaos, with the city's police almost completely under siege. The United States Armed Forces were then mobilized to help, and here we see an example of the difference in purpose and training. In a house on the outskirts of the city, supposedly, shots had been fired from inside a house at some police vehicles. A squad of Marines who were nearby ran to help the police officers. But with all the confusion, the police officers weren't sure if the shots were coming from that house, or even if there were any civilians, armed or unarmed, inside. All they could see was the silhouette of someone staring at them from inside the house. With that, a group of police officers tried to approach the house to try to neutralize the hostile elements that might or might not be there. And that's when one of the police officers shouted, "Cover me!" For the Los Angeles police, this means that the other officers should keep their weapons pointed in the direction of the building, only shooting if a hostile element came out and fired at them. But the expression "cover me" for the Marines means suppressive fire, or unload everything you have at the target while other soldiers move in on it. The same order, with the same words, but they mean very different things to the two groups. The American Marines riddled the house with more than 400 shots while the police officers moved in. And even with the police sergeant shouting to cease fire, the noise was so loud and the adrenaline so high that the Marines didn't hear the orders and kept shooting. The result was that the police officers finally went in. They entered the house only to find that it was empty and that no one had been inside. The silhouette they had seen was just an abandoned mannequin. Luckily, no one was hurt, but this is the point you need to understand. The purposes, training, and especially the doctrines of public security forces are different from those of national security forces. And I could stand here and recount hundreds of events just like this one. Historically, several civilizations and regimes have partially collapsed precisely because they did not maintain a clear separation between internal and external security forces. One example is the end of the Roman Republic. During the 1st century BC, generals like Sulla and Julius Caesar used their armies meant for external defense to intervene in Rome's internal politics, triggering civil wars. Sulla, in 88 BC, marched on Rome with his legions, something unprecedented until then. And he established a dictatorship, creating a dangerous precedent that an ambitious general could simply seize power by force of arms. This collapse of republican norms by using troops meant for external defense in internal disputes fatally weakened the institutions of the republic, paving the way for its end. And in the imperial phase of Rome, the Praetorian Guard, a force originally created to protect the emperor, became a political power of its own. Instead of ensuring order, the Praetorians began to overthrow emperors and auction off the throne to the highest bidder. Another notable case occurred in the Ottoman Empire, with the Janissaries, originally the Sultan's elite troops for external defense, evolving into a highly powerful internal faction. By the 18th and 19th centuries, they had become a corrupt and politically powerful faction that blocked military and administrative reforms in the empire, which, in a way, ended up causing the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Holding a monopoly on force in the interior and across major cities, including the capital, the Janissaries vetoed government decisions and even managed to have political opponents executed. In Imperial China during the Qin dynasty, regional armies and warlords fragmented central power, precisely because of the lack of a clear distinction between national forces and military factions, resulting in a system of warlordism, with warlords competing internally and undermining the empire's unified authority. And even in more recent times, many post-colonial countries have experienced what Samuel Huntington called Praetorian states, in which the military routinely intervenes in domestic politics because of the weakness of civilian institutions. In several countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia in the 20th century, the constant use of national armies for internal affairs undermined long-term stability. These Praetorian regimes often ended in collapse or tumultuous transition, because the merging of internal and external apparatuses led to violations of the social contract and cycles of instability instead of a permanent order. Successful nation-states usually make a clear distinction between external armed forces, the military, and internal security forces, the police. The logic behind this separation is that the missions and ethos of each type of force are different, sometimes even opposing each other. The military exists to face foreign threats and win wars, with the use of violence being much more permissible, employing the maximum level of lethal violence against external enemies. Police forces, on the other hand, aim to maintain law and order among citizens themselves, using force in a restricted manner and with legal legitimacy. The limits on police power, even if only theoretical, exist for a reason. After all, the taxpayer is paying so as not to be harmed by their own government institution. This doesn't apply to the military who are going to operate abroad. Of course, before some genius mentions that it's not always like this. In fact, it's not always like this. But the objectives will always be different. In modern democracies, and even in modern dictatorships that have some degree of administrative efficiency, this division is seen as a pillar of a minimally decent government. Of course, this line is not always clear. For most of history, there were no separate professional police forces. In general, they were armed young men who served both in war and in internal repression, and there was no clear distinction between what we now call the police and the army. The consolidation of the modern state involved creating this differentiation. State theorists like Max Weber make it very clear that a modern state claims the legitimate monopoly on force, and within it, specialized agencies are developed to exercise it internally or externally. And over time, the notion was formed that the army should always be directed outward, facing external threats and assuming a secure domestic order. Whereas military action within sovereign borders came to be seen as something exceptional, more related to state failure than to normality. In stable states, this distinction was reflected in legal and cultural structures. For example, in the United States, since 1878 there has been the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the use of the armed forces in domestic police functions, except for some authorized exceptions, reinforcing the idea that soldiers should not act as police officers. In Germany after World War II, the constitution made it very clear that the armed forces cannot operate domestically, except in cases of severe emergencies like natural disasters. And the reason behind this is clear. It's not just a trivial matter. When we compare the doctrines and protocols for the use of force by the military to those of the police forces, the reason for this becomes very clear. Military forces are trained as specialists in the appropriate use of maximum force. Basically, their mission is to kill, with heavy weaponry and rules of engagement designed to kill the enemy in combat. Civilian police, on the other hand, act as specialists in the minimal and appropriate use of force, lightly equipped and guided by the need to preserve lives and rights, using coercion only within limits. Of course, there may be cases of abuse, but the point is that the doctrine does not allow this, so cases of abuse happen outside the law, outside the doctrine. In other words, the soldier is trained to destroy the enemy, while the police officer is trained to protect the citizen, even from himself, and even if it is satisfying. To see criminals being deleted from existence by police officers? The problem is when those lines get blurred, we run the risk of seeing soldiers treating citizens as enemies. And the citizens are the ones who provide the funding and legitimacy for those soldiers. And when we look at history, it becomes clear. The most stable nations were those that knew how to maintain this balance. Great Britain, for example, was a pioneer in the creation of modern police forces in 1829, precisely to replace the use of troops in containing internal disturbances, after events like the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, when the military cavalry charged against civilian protesters, which obviously caused political damage to the government itself. In the United States, the subordination of the military to civilian power is clear since George Washington and the exceptional use of the armed forces on national soil. The armed forces are used internally only in cases of natural disasters or very serious disturbances, and even then, they remain under civilian command. In China today, the line is considered adaptable, but even so, it is still separate. in addition to the civil police under the Ministry of Public Security, which is responsible for criminal investigations, everyday policing, and various other public order functions. The country maintains the People's Armed Police as a paramilitary force focused on internal security for riot control and counter-terrorism, and the protection of government facilities. In the United Arab Emirates, the division is also formally clear in institutional arrangements. The Ministry of Interior integrates and supervises the police at the federal level and in each emirate, as well as internal security services. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Defense commands the traditional armed forces and elite units like the Presidential Guard, focused on external defense and regional protection. This dual structure model avoids both the excessive militarization of domestic life and the politicization of the armed forces. When the military starts to operate internally on a routine basis, they develop a sort of Praetorian appetite, so to speak. They may challenge elected authorities or improperly repress the population, or if they come to take a stand against the government. They may end up being deliberately neglected precisely because the leadership doesn't trust them. This ends up leaving the country's national security vulnerable. The state's monopoly on legitimate force is a central concept in modern political theory. It's tied to the state's legitimacy and the social contract. Max Weber defined the modern state as the human community that successfully claims the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. In other words, only the state can exercise or authorize violence in a legitimate way. This monopoly doesn't mean that only the state will actually use force, since individuals can still commit acts of violence, such as criminal groups, for example. But rather that only the state has the recognized right to use it. This principle is at the foundation of the social contract of the modern state, formulated by classical thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Rousseau. The citizens give up taking justice into their own hands and resorting to private violence, handing over that authority to the state, and in return, they expect protection and order. And if you think this only looks good on paper but is impractical in real life, I'm sorry, but yes, it is practical. We have examples of this, but it's not a guarantee that it will always be like that. After all, what we've seen more recently, not only in Brazil but in several countries, is exactly the state not fulfilling its side of this contract. The Hobbesian Leviathan, for example, arises from the need to escape a violent state of nature, where individuals agree to transfer their natural right to use force to a sovereign, who then protects them and maintains peace. Therefore, the legitimacy of the state comes largely from fulfilling its part of this pact, to use its monopoly on force to guarantee security. Always in a way that is seen by the population as fair. The risks of breaking this social contract happen when the state loses its monopoly on force or exercises that force in an illegitimate way. If the state fails to guarantee security, or if it itself becomes the violator of citizens' rights. Trust is broken. Citizens may then begin to challenge state authority or seek alternatives to the protection it should provide. That's what we're seeing. That's what's happening. When figures like vigilantes and private militias start to emerge, this kind of parallel justice typically arises where there is a sense of impunity and abandonment. Although vigilantes claim to be defending the community by taking force into their own hands outside legal channels, they are challenging the state's monopoly on violence. And one thing that needs to stay in your mind permanently is that people hunger for a sense of justice. And if the state doesn't provide that feeling, then people will be willing to accept that feeling even if it comes from other groups. Another consequence of the erosion of the state's monopoly is the emergence of parallel powers. When insurgent groups, guerrillas, warlords, or criminal groups control a territory, they impose their own law. They establish parallel sources of legitimate authority. This happens, for example, in failed states like Somalia in the 1990s, post-Gaddafi Libya in 2011, in parts of Afghanistan, and more recently in Brazil, as we are seeing in Rio de Janeiro and in the state of Ceará. In these cases, the social contract is broken. The local population no longer recognizes the central state as the sole legitimate holder of force. And regarding the efficiency of fighting crime, the results are also different when carried out by police forces or by military forces. In general, evidence indicates that policing carried out by the military tends to be much less effective in reducing and can bring negative side effects compared to the work of well-trained police. A study published in 2023 experimentally analyzed a military patrol operation in the city of Cali, Colombia. The Fortaleza Plan, which sent heavily armed soldiers to high-crime neighborhoods. The published results revealed that there was no reduction in crime rates during the intervention, and there were negative effects after it ended. In other words, while the army soldiers were patrolling the streets, there was no positive change in security, and after they withdrew, certain categories of crime even increased above the previous level. And similar results. Similar results appeared in other studies from different contexts in the United States. Although the situation is different, statistical studies also did not find any benefits in terms of crime reduction. Military personnel are not trained for investigation, for example, or community prevention or handling complex civilian situations. They usually don't know the local geography, they don't know the population, which is fundamental for gathering intelligence. They can bring a lot of firepower and immediate intimidation, but they don't address the causes of crime. Often, they can't even identify the right criminals because they don't have local intelligence data. Moreover, the presence of armed soldiers in civilian areas can simply displace crime. From one place to another, criminals just hide or move temporarily instead of the crime actually being eliminated. There are many people who like to see big weapons and are thrilled by uniforms. What they don't understand is that the police officer is just the tip of the iceberg in public security. And just messing with that tip, replacing police officers with military personnel, is useless if the rest of the iceberg isn't functional as well. For example, in those famous cases where the police arrest criminals only for judges to release them afterwards. It wasn't the police officers' incompetence or their equipment that made the difference, but rather the behind-the-scenes factors that hindered the officers' work. But it can also get worse because in many scenarios in Latin America, the prolonged involvement of the military in internal security has been linked to more violations. In Mexico, more than 15 years of militarized drug wars have resulted in thousands of reports of torture. Disappearances and extrajudicial executions have been attributed to the armed forces, while at the same time criminal violence has only continued to grow. Over time, after so much exposure, the military themselves became more vulnerable to the same problems that affect the police, such as issues involving corruption and mission creep. In other words, what was bad got even worse. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know, para ajudar o canal a continuar existindo. E se você To help the channel, consider becoming a member. If you become a member, not only do you get early access to videos, access to exclusive videos and exclusive live streams, but also, depending on your membership level, your name will appear at the end in the credits. Continuing. Thank you. Take care, and see you in the next video.